You're mostly British Tamils, so I'm going to say this. There's an election coming. This is the right time to start asking.
Many of us who don't really have answers, don't know the whole story.
Baikal has ended. The work that countless people have done on the homeland, in the diaspora, just the continuous work, small and large scale, has kept this issue on the international agenda. No one has forgotten Sri Lanka. That's
a British Tamil individual, like, now's the time. This is the moment where we have leverage to ask these questions with things like, for example, GST.
Still there on the BBC, loud and proud, and it perpetuates violence.
So that in May 2009, the Sri Lankan government was able to kind of unleash that violence because of this, the war on terror framing, because there's no one node that is irreplaceable in this network.
Actually, that's why you didn't get a chance to meet her.
Did she die in the war?
In Sri Lanka, I don't remember my father being around.
The 77 riots and the 83 pogroms
Was obviously the ground being pulled out from underneath everybody's lives.
When I graduated and started working, and people ask me, where are you from? And I'm saying Sri Lankan Tamil. And then right away they go, are you Sri Lankan tiger? Or do you guys are terrorists?
My father was a police inspector. One of the most important event that he has written down was the night before the 1983 riots.
The Sixth Amendment to the Constitution of Sri Lanka denies the very basic freedom of expression of the Tamils to advocate for their self-determination.
And the children, the next generation, right? They have so much. We didn't get to see the pieces of the conversations that need to be had and haven't been had. How many of you in the room have tried to have Tamils who have tried to have a conversation with your parents or grandparents about, what happened to us? Why are we here? What's the story about our family? Have you asked those questions? Have you received true answers? But that was me. And many of us who don't really have answers, don't know the whole story. My parents still refuse to have conversations about holistic conversations about what happened. And that's a lot of our evidence that's going to die off. We need to be documenting our lived experiences and engaging with the UN mechanism. I mean, many of you probably have. A lot of the requests is for evidence, because the Sri Lankan government is continuously providing evidence, whereas we're not providing sufficient of those evidences. And so if we, as a global diaspora of, I don't know what the number is now, do you know what the number is? Close to 1 million at least. That could be 1 million pieces of evidence if each one of us documents our stories. It could be an email, a letter, make a movie, or just take your phone and record your stories. Have those conversations and record our stories. That's 1 million pieces of evidence that we could be submitting to prove the ongoing genocide of Tamil people on the island nation that's called Sri Lanka.
And also, Radhika, you mentioned in your documentary the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution. To what extent, I think it will be interesting to hear from all the panelists, to what extent does the Sixth Amendment impede on Tamils' rights to self-determination or criminalize them?
So I think the answer to that is actually relatively quick, which is that it fully impedes on Tamils' rights to self-determination, because it prevents Tamils on the island from being able to actually vocalize without running the risk of being arrested, any interest in self-determination. But on the legal aspect of this, and just to kind of pick up on what's been said, I am not so optimistic. I love Madhurika's optimism, but I think as a community we run the risk of getting too complacent. with things. And looking at the audience here, you're mostly British Tamils, so I'm going to say this: there's an election coming. This is the right time to start asking and demanding things. It looks like it's probably going to be a different party who comes into power. So now's the time to start asking your local MPs who are running for that party what their plans are. At the moment, the UK has sanctioned 0 people from Sri Lanka. The US has sanctioned a few people. Canada's done pretty well, but the UK has sanctioned no one. And if their argument was, well, actually, we don't want to sanction them because we want them to come here to prosecute them, that's also not happening. So if you are a British Tamil individual, like, now's the time. This is the moment where we have leverage to ask these questions. With things like, for example, GSP Plus, which some of you may have been aware of, it was the trading scheme that was set up between Europe and Sri Lanka. And I should add, I am a lawyer, so I'm going to be very practical about things. When it comes to things like trading, Sri Lanka relies quite heavily on trade with Europe and the UK. There is a scheme in place in the EU called GSP Plus, which gives preferential trading status to certain developing countries and is premised on them making progress on human rights. Obviously, the UK has left the EU now, and the UK has set up its own scheme called, I think, DCTS. It has still just rolled over in terms of Sri Lanka, and there's been no conversations and frankly not enough advocacy actually done to push the UK on why they think Sri Lanka is a country deserving of special tariffs in respect of that scheme. They obviously are continuing to not hold accountability for any of the ongoing violations, any of the atrocity crimes or genocidal crimes that have occurred, and still, to date, Sri Lanka gets that preferential trading status from both the UK and the EU. So, I mean, these are the questions that we as a community can be putting to our local MPs, to individuals who we think might quickly and very soon be in cabinet, who haven't been so far, and also asking other parties as to what their positions are on things. Our votes shouldn't be taken for granted. I say our because I actually have the right to vote here now. I do think that, like, as a community, we can't run the risk of being complacent. And I think, one of the things, like, one of the most powerful things we as a community have is we are able to amplify things. Like, when stuff happens, we're really, really good at getting the message out and making Sri Lanka feel what's happened. Like, the example I always think of is in 2018 or 19, there was a defense attaché to the Sri Lankan embassy, Brigadier Fernando, who had made threatening gestures, throat-slitting gestures at Tamil protesters outside of the embassy. And very creatively, and I think very smartly, those protesters went and registered a complaint immediately at the local police station. He was then charged under a private prosecution with a public order offense, of which he was convicted. Now, obviously, it was acquitted because the magistrate who convicted him didn't realize that they had no jurisdiction to do that. But the point is, in those months where that case was brought and then he was convicted, Tamil diaspora media sent that message out, and it was felt in Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankan government felt that it was happening. This is the kind of thing that we need to be doing, because truthfully, a lot of the evidence that we have is from our side of things. It's the victim side of things. What we need is perpetrator evidence. We need to be placing pressure on Sri Lankan soldiers, on Sri Lankan state officials, on Sri Lankan military officials to crack. That is how we will eventually get that single prosecution that opens up everything else. I think that as a community we are very powerful, but I don't want us to get complacent with things. Like, it's great that we are getting so much momentum about genocide recognition, and I think that needs to continue. But I also think when it comes to things like justice, accountability, on the legal side of things, we need to keep that pressure up as well, whether that looks like pushing for sanctions or pushing for universal jurisdiction style prosecutions. And this is an opportune moment in the UK where there is potentially going to be a shift. So this is the time to do it.
The politically sort of dominant force in Sri Lanka's politics and history has been this thing called Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. and its kind of capacity to reshape state, society, unchecked really, unaccountable, right, for several decades is at the root cause of the conflict. But I think what often gets missed is it's also like it hasn't ended with the end of the war. It continues, right? And although the kind of the Tamils, I want to say two things about that. First of all, the first thing I want to say about this is that this idea of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, which simply put is that, the Sinhala Buddhists are the ones who should own the island and everybody else should have a kind of subordinate place, compared to the kind of the other perspective, the Tamil perspective, which is not that there should be a state called Tamilulam, but which was there are multiple peoples on this island, all of whom are indigenous, right? That was the initial Tamil positions. Tamils are very, very late secessionists, although we're often portrayed as kind of mad. I read a BBC article recently on the disappearance of Father Francis Joseph. Actually, for some reason I was thinking about Father Francis Joseph, and I saw this, where is Father Francis Joseph? And there was a line there, and it made me so enraged. Like, I have not felt that level of activist rage for a long time. But I think it was because it was May 18th. It made me so kind of angry. It's still there on the BBC, loud and proud, and it perpetuates violence, this kind of lies, right? And it says something like, Tamils just decided they wanted a separate state. Nobody knows why. Right? Some decided they wanted a separate state and started an armed struggle, right? And so the longevity of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism and the capacity, the way in which it has reshaped and transformed and really seeped into all kinds of understandings of what Sri Lanka is the point still needs to be made, I think. And to your point about documenting histories, it also immediately made me think of something else that is now lost to our history, because we haven't done this work enough. And it's my grandmother, actually, who passed. And she was in the 1962 Satyagraha. Oh, wow. Right? She was an active participant in the 1962 Satyagraha. She was a teacher, and she was very good at singing. She was a Carnatic vocalist, so she could sing songs, and she would lead the other protesters in the Satyagraha, and they occupied the space in front of the Jaffna Kacheri for days and days and days. And so, but the history of the non-violent resistance, the history of the Satyagraha, lost, right? It's almost gone, because if you think about the people who would have been able to actively participate in that, they're probably no longer with us, right? So I think that, first of all, that point needs to be made that this resistance didn't come out of nowhere. The violence of May 2009 doesn't come out of nowhere. States don't suddenly become genocidally violent. Israel's violence today in Gaza it's been there. It's been, building up for decades and decades and decades. States don't become this way overnight. But also, I think it's really worth pointing out, it hasn't ended. This capacity of the state and the way in which the state is formed, the Sinhala Buddhist mindset, if you like, it hasn't ended. You can see it now in violence against other communities, in violence against Muslims, in violence against Christians. And I think you also see it really in terms of the kind of the economic dysfunction that Sri Lanka is, its complete inability to find a sustainable path of economic growth and development. Because if your strategy for economic growth and development is an ethnocratic one, effectively, right, that you want to maintain a certain ethnic hierarchy, but that ethnic hierarchy is not one that the global economy can support or will support, then you will just have economic dysfunction, right? And so for 6 decades or something, the state has been somewhat subsidized by global flows. And the work that I'm looking at in the coming months and coming years is to really think about, why has this crisis been so bad? What does it tell us about the nature of the economy in Sri Lanka and the way in which it's situated in the global economy, that the crisis has been so bad? So yes, I would say that it's almost like a tired trope now, the Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. But I do think it needs to be reiterated, because just as in the Israel-Palestine conflict, history did not start on October 7th.
No, Israel-Palestine started in 1948.
Kind of like us.
And for us, the Tamil genocide started in 1948,
Yeah.
and so did Palestine. The
Yeah.
Palestinian genocide started in 1948, and both continue. Palestine is right now at the 9th stage of genocide, which is the mass extermination or massacre of people, which is what happened to us 15 years ago. Mulivaikal was us at the 9th stage of genocide. We're in the 10th stage of genocide now, which is denial, where the government, the Sri Lankan government, is openly, and that's their advocacy work, is saying, no, this doesn't exist. Look how beautifully we build roads, we're hospitals, we're trying to be nice, we are being nice, but they're not receiving our niceness and
generosity.
And our generosity, that's the better word. Yes. Our benevolence and our generosity, they're not interested in it. They're just angry.
Well, the diaspora is angry.
The diaspora is angry, yes,
yeah.
not the people on the ground.
Yeah.
Yet we see people on the ground and what they live through every day. Ryan and I had over 26 hours of footage from when we went, and we lost the day of the orphanage. You didn't see any actual videos because that's when they came to arrest me, and we had to actually toss all of our what are they called? Cards. SD cards, our memory devices, because if they caught us with that stuff on us, then maybe that would have been grounds for them to actually arrest me or Ryan. And so we tossed it, and so we only had photos that we had uploaded to the cloud. And we have so much, where was I going with this? I don't remember where I was going with this. Oh, footage of people who, there was this one group that we met with. They were farmers and local activists and whatever. We arrived at somebody's house. It was a meeting where the drivers were all told, once you reach this point, turn off the engine, turn off the lights, and you're just gonna coast on neutral until you get to the house. And it's basically a tuck and roll at the house. And the drivers don't even stop and get out, nothing. It's literally open the door and run out and go into the house. And we met with very, very minimal lighting because they didn't want anybody to know that people were in this house. And at the end, we asked if we could record, and they said no. No pictures, no videos. Can we just audio maybe? And they said no, because they'll recognize our voice. If we ever find this recording, they'll know who we are, so no. And we're like, can we take a photo at the end to, just for us? No. Can we take a picture of just our feet sitting in a circle because we sat in a circle and spoke? They were scared that they would recognize their toes. And that's how much fear that they continue to live with, yet it's only the diaspora who is making a big fuss. It's not really a big deal. Unfortunately, we are in that denial phase. I do hold on to hope, though, because the Armenian genocide was only recognized 105 years later, I think it was? 105 years later, so we're well on our way, but we hold on to hope. Yeah, our work. We got a lot of work, folks.
Yeah, sorry to, yeah.
No, go for it. I'm sorry, it's your panel.
Sorry. I have the kind of the optimism of the simple-minded, but I think there is kind of scope for hope, because the appalling events in Gaza that are unfolding and the uncanny similarities with what went on in Sri Lanka. But one thing that has happened in the world that is different from 2009, and this is good, is that the issues of international justice, of law, of humanitarian protection, and of addressing the root causes of the conflict. The language is back, not just of the two-state solution, which is something that Israel's worked very hard to prevent, but Palestinian self-determination. That language is back, right? And justice, the language of justice is back. So those issues are back on the international agenda, and that's a kind of progress from 2009, I think. And those issues are also issues that are kind of important for us. And what I would say is also that in May 2009, the Sri Lankan government was able to kind of unleash that violence because of the war on terror framing, all of these kinds of things, the dominant framings of the war, that the LTT's kind of maniacal, mad violence just came out of the blue, no reason.
And so many states calling the LTT terrorist
organizations and not really looking at the political causes of the conflict at all. All of those things happened. But what I would say is in the past 15 years of activism, we have kind of won some discursive space, right? The idea that it's not plausible for people to say, as the Sri Lankan state did just after May 2009, that no one died. Right? It's not plausible to say that. It's not plausible to say that there were no casualties. It's not plausible to say any of those things.
Really, like, transitional justice is quite a bad word now across the Northeast. Like, I remember in 2015 the government changed, and in 2016, within like a couple months, every INGO under the sun had descended on Sri Lanka who had any kind of funding for transitional justice. And for some reason, they all came to the Northeast because obviously it's the Tamil community that needs to be convinced of the need for justice, not the Sinhala community. And so workshop after workshop was held. Families of the disappeared were trotted out to tell their stories, cry, be incredibly re-traumatized, and then not given anything in return. They were made promises as to what transitional justice would entail, what it would look like. And to be honest, like, a lot of them engaged. Like, there's this misconception of some of them as having been spoilers or having always been against any possible change. But actually, in 2016, when the Sri Lankan government set up the Consultation Task Force, which was a domestic institution, but under the UN Human Rights Council resolution at the time, many of the mothers of the disappeared who are now leaders of the protests engaged. They actually signed up, were zonal task force leaders, they led consultations, participated in the report writing, and then in 2017, when the government refused to accept the report, and then eventually it was given to Chandrika Kumaratunga, who herself is a former president, they just lost any hope because the government had basically dismissed it and said, oh, it wasn't your mandate to tell us about accountability. You were just supposed to tell us what kind of commission we needed to build. And that is when so February 2017, right after that, is when they began protesting. And so I think that from their perspective, transitional justice, like if you go to any of the protest sites and say transitional justice, you will be pushed out. And they view it as quite a bad thing because of what happened when it was raised kind of post 2015. So I think from their perspective, it's justice, accountability, even truth. Unfortunately, has a bit of a connotation to it because Truth Commission after Truth Commission has existed. But I mean, they obviously do also want truth, but for them it's justice, accountability, and if there's got to be accountability, they've been offered other things, and what they want is accountability.
It can't come from a domestic mechanism. And that they've been very clear on that they've engaged so much with all of the domestic mechanisms that have been introduced, and they're not working. So it has to be an international mechanism.
Hope, this moment when the world, in the global agenda, these issues are back again with a kind of prominence, alongside the appalling suffering. Mm-hmm. There is also, it's important to note that in the 15 years since Mullivaikkal has ended, the work that countless people have done on the homeland, in the diaspora, just the continuous work, small and large scale, has kept this issue on the international agenda. No one has forgotten Sri Lanka. That didn't happen by accident.
Yeah, it was supposed to be a silent genocide, and it's the work of everybody that's kind of kept it going. And I don't know if I should say good and genocide in the same massacre in the same sentence, but I'm going to. The good thing about what's happening with the Palestinians today is that there is social media. The world is seeing. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people are becoming desensitized to the atrocities that are happening, but at least the world is seeing. Mullivaikkal, hardly anybody knew anything happened. And it was hard to get any information out of Sri Lanka because of all the media bans, because of all the NGOs were sent out. The journalists weren't able to actually communicate. So it was in the film, you didn't hear it. There were some FM radio pieces, clips that we were able to use. And that's what we had. We had a lot of FM radio clips and then satellite photo images that we were able to get of people being cornered into that strip of land in Mullivaikkal. And what's happening right now with the refugee camps being bombed, shelled, whatever the right word is, attacked. That's exactly what happened in Sri Lanka. There's so many parallels, and it's a good thing that it's being documented right now in Gaza. I mean, it shouldn't be happening, but it's a good thing that it's being documented, so that it's undeniable. Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember when we did have a lead organization, and when that lead organization is decapitated purposefully and in a singular and targeted way, then you have to regather, right? It's devastating, actually. It's happened in Tamil history twice. The Federal Party, and when the Federal Party lost its leader, right? And it's a kind of decapitation, and then the second time. So I'm actually very, very happy with this dispersed network, because there's no one node that is irreplaceable in this network.